Okay, so we're going to wrap up this gunpowder empires. Pretty sure y'all are excited for that. We've been through the Ottomans, we've been through the Russians, the Safavids, the Mughals. We looked at the Ming Dynasty, and now we're going to look at the Qing Dynasty, the beginnings of the Qing Dynasty, and the unification of Japan as the samurai and the shogunate start declining, and you have a more unified Japan. I said that we're going to kind of look at the beginnings of the Qing Dynasty. Remember, the Qing Dynasty lasts from 1644 to 1912. So it's going to overlap our era, our time period going from 1450 to 1750 here. So we'll talk about the Qing Dynasty mainly up to about 1750 and where it's at. And then we're going to move into the unification of Japan and see how the shogunates start losing their power, samurai start losing their power, and we start the birth process of a unified Japan and kind of the infancy of what we know Japan as today. So let's go ahead and get started. This isn't going to be a long one, so we'll hopefully get done with this in no time. The Qing Dynasty, like I said, 1644 to 1912. You have a massive population explosion during the Qing Dynasty. It replaced the Ming Dynasty after famine and plague, created these peasant uprisings, as we know the dynastic process, and it was founded by Manchu warlords. That's why, if in history, if you're reading, and I don't know how your book puts it, but it may talk about the Manchu or the Manchu dynasty, or it may talk about the Qing dynasty. They are one and the same. The Manchu dynasty is the Qing dynasty. And so we have between 1650 and 1750, we have a massive population boom. And this is going to be credited to a large scale agriculture, products, food that can be quickly produced and produced in high yields. This included 30% of the world's population by 1750. 30%, almost a third of the world's population is in the Qing dynasty by 1750. You have this massive intensification of peasant labor. This is for one big purpose. It takes a lot of people to feed a population the size of China's. It still does. So you have this large-scale focus on large-scale agriculture on these farms because there's a lot of mouths to feed in the Qing dynasty, and so a large amount of the land in China is dedicated to agriculture. And as we know, the Yellow River Valley is very fertile to produce a lot of food, and they're going to need just about every square inch of that in order to feed this massive population. So that's sort of where the Qing dynasty is. Now, one of the things that made the Qing so popular right after the Ming is the fact that they've gone from famine to food. Anybody and everybody gets excited when somebody can feed you. People all the time question how in the of course, with large scale agriculture, you're going to have agricultural taxes. And because so much of the Qing dynasty was dedicated to agriculture and feeding people, you have a large tax base. You have a lot of people you can tax and a lot of farms you can tax. And when you have a lot of tax base, a large tax base, you get huge revenues. And initially, the Qing pumped this into their people. Peasants could own land and were given financial aid to relocate, to grow things. They understood we've got to feed these people. So they were given money, equipment, seeds to relocate, to move, and grow. And as I was talking about, this population boom was due in large part to the fact that they were growing fast producing high yield crops. Um, they were growing champa style rice. Remember we talked about champa style. Champa style rice is very important for a few things. One, you need to know it comes from Vietnam. Champa style rice comes from Vietnam. Number two, you need to understand and remember that champa rice is drought resistant. It can grow in much drier climates than other rice can. And the other big thing is it produces high yields. That means a lot of crop quickly, which means that you can plant, harvest, plant, harvest, plant, harvest quicker. And when you can do that, you can turn over a lot of crops. So they're growing champa style rice, sweet potatoes, which we talked about the importance of as it comes over from the New World thanks to the Columbian Exchange, and of course maize. Excuse me. So this is the big reason for such a stable and growing population during the Qing dynasty. Both the Ming and Qing dynasties retained Confucian scholar gentry. These are the bureaucrats. These are the smart people. We talked about in the last video how the Ming dynasty got sort of reclaimed China and became China as we've known it. The isolation, the Confucian-based social hierarchy, social order, the power of the five relations, filial piety. We've got all of those in place by the Ming, and the Qing absolutely bought into that as well. They are retaining Confucian principles and Confucian style thinking. Here's the downfall to that, though. When you put all your eggs in the Confucius basket, the downfall is that your focus is on the classics, literary classics, that Confucius was so adamant that people knew. You spend your scholarly time learning and focusing on these literary classics. But we're dealing with a post-Columbian world here. We're dealing with post-Columbian world. Technology, science is taking off. New innovations are sprouting all over the world. And so this focus on literary classics instead of science is really going to limit the manufacturing capabilities of China down the road, which is why they're so agriculturally based. They're going to have food, but they're going to find themselves behind in manufacturing and producing goods. The wealthy, in turn, because of this this embracing Confucian style, the wealthy would use their money for education, to educate themselves on these literary classics instead of investing in manufacturing. Here's a map of the Qing dynasty. You can see, and it's the key's a little small, but this is just your basic expansion map. The red arrows are military expeditions, and of course, the little wall-like looking things is the Great Wall. So let's jump the water and head over to Japan. When we left Japan, we talked about the Heian period. We talked about the best of the best, the richest of the rich, sort of making a life for themselves. And then we started talking about, and we elaborated on the arrival and the domination of the shogunates. So let me encourage you to go back in your notes and take a look at that feudal Japan era, Japanese feudalism, as you mow through this section, because this is sort of the sequel to that. Um, it's like writing a book and reading a book, and then 12 years later you got the sequel to it. That's sort of what it feels like here because we've covered so much material. So go back and look at your Japanese feudalism notes, and this is the sort of the sequel to that. So by 1467, there's 260 daimyo, and you can go back to the comparison charts between European feudalism and Japanese feudalism and see how they interact there and what a daimyo is compared to a European feudalism. Each daimyo was independent with its own army. Of course, you're dealing with the age of the samurai here. And this period is known as the Warring States period in Japan, much like China had their Warring States period far, far back at this point in time, well over 1,500 years ago. But 4 centuries of feudal warfare finally end in 1600. 400 years of feudal warfare ends by 1600. Oda Nobunaga, it takes me a second to get that name right. Oda Nobunaga. Another key figure here, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, freezes social classes, makes it to where there's no elevation in social classes. He elevates the samurai. Only they could carry swords and have last names. I thought that was unique, that they got to have last names in that symbolic gesture there. But he elevates the samurai as, trying to, the samurai, while black powder weapons sort of took a chink out of their armor, so to speak, the samurai aren't done yet. The samurai are not done yet. Enter Tokugawa Ieyasu, who finally unifies Japan in 1603. So these last, let me go back for a second. Sorry, I'm recording here. So I can't go back. But these last couple of rulers here, or these last 3 people that we've talked about, Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu, are the key figures in finally bringing about an end to the feudal period in Japan and finally uniting Japan under Ieyasu. Ieyasu is responsible for starting the Tokugawa shogunate. The emperors lived in Kyoto, while the shoguns lived in Edo. Now, the emperor, remember in this time period, the emperor is just a figurehead. They want to keep the emperor because it is, well, basically tradition. The Japanese people liked the tradition of having the emperor, but they were not in charge. And the emperors lived in Kyoto. They were well taken care of, and they would wheel them out, and they would do. Of the 30 million people of Japan's total population at this point in time, 2 million were samurai. That's a pretty high number. There's one story, and if you see this title of the slide here, it's 47 Samurai Revolt. And that's not the year 47, that's the number of samurai. So at one court, you have Lord Asano, who was angered by Lord Kira. So these two get into it, and Asano drew his sword. Now, in the samurai code, This is a no-no. You do not draw your sword in the court of someone else. So, out of the breaking of the samurai code, Lord Asano is forced to commit seppuku. Now, if you don't remember what seppuku is, I'll be glad to tell you, because this is, disembowelment. I like that stuff. So, seppuku, remember, if a samurai, if a warrior is dishonored, then in any way, then he must commit seppuku, which is self-disembowelment. You take the ceremonial seppuku dagger, you thrust it in, you thrust it over, and you thrust it up. And of course, you have your trusted friend there. If you can't finish the task, his job is to chop your head off. Lord Asano is forced to commit seppuku. 2 years later, his 47 samurai, the samurai who served under Lord Asano, stormed Kira's palace and kill him to avenge their master, Lord Asano. All 47 voluntarily commit seppuku because of this dishonor of the code, but they had gotten their revenge on Lord Kira, and even today, Japanese literature still paint these 47 samurai as heroes. Um, so as this time progresses, you see a movement towards Japanese isolationism, um, and much like Europe, they're going to come out of the feudal period into the imperial period, and they're going to ease their way out of it. And as this time goes along, you've got support for foreigners, but that is going to be replaced with xenophobia. Now, xenophobia is the fear of other races or other ethnicities, other groups, other people groups. So they're on a kick of not having anything to do with anything China or Chinese. So many rejected Chinese learning. They supported the School of National Learning by Kokugaku. Say that 3 times fast. They passed a series of seclusion acts, one of them being the Japanese Seclusion Act of 1636. I recommend you Googling that because I'm not going to go take the time to go into it. But the Japanese Seclusion Act of 1636 will sort of paint you a picture of this Japanese isolation movement. And they had limited influence of the West. Now, they were very happy to deal with the Dutch. They were very happy to deal with the Dutch. Now, the Dutch were trading with the Chinese at Macau and Canton, but they get their own port in Japan. And so the Dutch were limited to trading with Japan, but they were given the port of Nagasaki. And so the Dutch the Dutch are stinking filthy rich at this point in time. They're making money hand over fist. And so everybody's interested in trading with them because they are the rich kids. So they were limited to the port of Nagasaki, but they did have a port. And there was some interest in Western ideas, and that interest continued. And they had scholars who would study at schools of Dutch studies, and just to kind of get that. And finally, Tokugawa culture, and this final shogunate, the Tokugawa shogunate, really loved their culture. They had tea houses, brothels, theaters, public baths were very popular at this point in time. You have new forms of theaters, and I don't know if you've ever heard of kabuki, but it still goes on today. But kabuki is you may have seen these really ornate masks, Japanese masks. Chances are what you're looking at is a kabuki mask. Um, Kabuki mask would be an example of kabuki mask would be the mask worn in Big Hero 6. When we talked about the um, syncretism of Japanese and American culture there. But kabuki becomes a real, very popular form of theater, still very popular today. And then you've got Bunraku, which is this elaborate puppet show. And I'm not sure if that's still going on today. I think it is. You might want to look at that. Um, Ukiyo-e, or I'm assuming I'm pronouncing that right, don't hold me to it, but woodblock prints. There's an example below of a woodblock print, this painting done on these woodblocks. And so these become very popular in Japanese culture. So this takes us to basically the end of the Tokugawa, the end-ish of the Tokugawa culture, the Tokugawa shogunate. We'll pick up the very end of the Tokugawa shogunate next time period, as Japan continues to transition. Of course, again, we'll also pick up the Qing dynasty in the next time period as it runs through 1912. So that's it for the gunpowder empires. We'll wait and see how the weather does, and maybe we'll be back in school to start talking about the maritime empires. But as far as the gunpowder empires, we're done. Now, again, if you haven't seen the video on the